Like pretty much every competitive game out there, Yu-Gi-Oh! Takes a lot of time and practice to actually get good at. And for a lot of you guys out there, you're having difficulty maybe getting your first locals win, or your first regional invite, your first regional top. And in today's video, I want to go over 5 easy ways to get better at Yu-Gi-Oh! And I say easy ways because these are all things that require very little investments from you guys. You know, you're going to be practicing, you're going to be play testing, deck building, all those things. And these are 5 easy changes that you can do if you want to improve at Yu-Gi-Oh! Whether or not you're going for that first invite or that first top, it doesn't really matter. I think a lot of us just want to improve, and if you haven't heard about these tips, they could be very valuable. The first tip is to make sure all of your copies of cards are the same rarity within your play set. So for example, if you're playing 3 copies of Call by the Grave, make sure they're either all common or all ultra or all super or all prismatic, whatever the case may be. You don't have to play the highest rarity, that's not what I'm saying here. I'm just saying if you are playing multiple copies of a card, make sure they are the exact same rarity. And I think a lot of people do this just normally because they think it looks better when you have matching rarities, and I think that is the case for me, but a lot of people go out of their way to play like 3 different rarities. I think it looks cooler if you do it that way, and while I understand where you're coming from, there actually is a strategic disadvantage to playing mismatching rarities. For example, what about Paleozoic Dino-Miscus? This is a card that actually saw a little bit of play last format, and even currently still seeing some play in a variety of decks, just sort of as a tech option to out certain cards, and it's a card that comes in both super rare and common. So let's say in game 1 you flip your common version of the card, you banish an opponent's monster, and then in game 2 you flip your super rare version of the card. Now your opponent knows that you're playing at least 2 copies, and I'm sure I'll get at least 1 or 2 comments from less competitive players or even upcoming competitive players that say, well, why does it really matter? I mean, who's really paying attention to that sort of thing? But when it comes down to it, the more competitive players, the players you're going to be playing against if you go to a regional or a YCS or a competitive locals, they're going to notice those things. And especially with cards that aren't always played as 2-ofs or 3-ofs, something like Twin Twisters or Red Reboot, cards that people sometimes play just 1 of or 2 of and sometimes play a full 3 copies, those are the types of cards that you really want to make sure that all of your versions are the exact same edition and rarity and language. I guess I should throw that in there as well. I know it can seem cool to play like 3 different versions of a card, and I get that people want to do that, but from a strategic standpoint, having matching versions of cards and matching languages is a really good way to not give your opponent any free information. And keep in mind here that I'm aware that not everyone has all versions of a card available to them, and in those cases, maybe just buy a playset of like the lowest rarity version of a card instead of just having like 1 secret rare like Artifact Lancia and 2 commons. The second thing I want to talk about is one that's directly related to regionals and YCSs and WCQs, and that is call a judge if you're skeptical. So I know that not every single local tournament has a judge available, but at a regional qualifier or a YCS or any bigger events, you always have judges walking around that you can ask questions to, and I see a lot of players get themselves into situations where either both players or one player are confused about what the actual ruling or interaction is, and that's a really bad thing because you don't want to have something happen to you where you take your opponent's word on how a card works or how a combo works, and then a couple rounds later you're telling your friends about that round and they go, wait a second, that's not actually how that works. Then you feel pretty bad for not calling a judge. If you're confused about any ruling, if you're confused about policy, if you think your opponent might be slow playing but you're not entirely sure, just call a judge. That is what they are there for. They're there to help the players out, and I know that it can seem scary, and sometimes I even see people like raise their hand and they don't yell judge very loud and they wait a couple seconds and they put their hand down and say we can just keep going. Please don't do that. You'll take unnecessary losses that otherwise could have been turned into wins. The judges are there to help out the players, so make sure to actually take advantage of their presence because they're very knowledgeable and you can actually learn a lot of stuff if you ask them the right questions. What I'm saying is that you need to make a play, and then if you're confused about the ruling, ask a judge about it. Please know that a judge cannot advise you on a play before it has been made. That is considered coaching. So when you call a judge over, you have to have already attempted the play, but if you do ask the right questions about what actually is going on, those right questions might actually help you learn 1 or 2 new rulings. The third tip that I have for you guys is sort of the other side of the coin from the first one. So the first thing that we talked about wasn't so much telling your opponent free information, but just putting it out there for them to sort of take how they will. However, what's even worse than that is not just putting information out there for your opponent to sort of gather if they're willing to pay attention, but actually straight up telling them information that you definitely don't have to and shouldn't be telling them in the first place. For example, do you know that you don't actually have to decide who goes first or second until both players are done side decking after games 1 and and 2. I see so many newer players especially tell their opponent if they're going first or second before both players are done side decking, and I always feel really bad when I see that because the newer player doesn't realize how valuable that information is. For example, there's some other things as well. So you like shouldn't reveal set cards in between games. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but a lot of times when people like brick or something, when they scoop, they reveal their hand to their opponent. Obviously, you shouldn't do that. You don't need to tell your opponent what you're playing. You don't need to reveal any of your set cards to give them free information. Also, you don't need to tell your opponent your bad beat story from the previous round. Don't say something like, oh, my opponent drew the red reboot for my back row cards. Don't say something along the lines of, oh, my opponent Ash Blossom my Orcus Nightmare and I had to pass. I know people will basically tell bad beat stories to anyone who will listen, even if those people don't want to hear about it, but especially for your opponents, you don't want to tell them too much information when you don't actually have to. The next tip is to watch as many topping deck profiles as possible, even the meta decks, especially the times when they're coming from players who have repeated success at tournaments. And I say that because I know a lot of casual players think that all meta decks are the same, they just summon a bunch of monsters, set up a bunch of negates, but what really separates the good players from the great players is their tech choices, their metagame calls. So when you're watching a Salamangreat list from like Jesse Cotton, you're gonna learn a lot more than you would if you watched just your average Salamangreat player that maybe got their invite at a regional. And I say that because a lot of people just don't want to watch meta deck profiles, but there is so much important information in those deck profiles. Maybe if you don't even care about the deck itself, but you want to know like what your opponents are playing so that when you go to a tournament, you know how to play against them. For example, oftentimes before I go to an event, I look at the previous couple weeks and see if people are playing Red Reboot or Evenly Match or Twin Twisters, so that when I go to my tournament, I know which cards are the most popular side deck options, maybe even for specific decks. So sometimes Thunder Dragon decks play a lot of Denko Sekka, sometimes they play Red Reboots, sometimes they play Evenly Match or Eradicator Epidemic Virus. It's really important to know what the trends of the meta decks are so you can better prepare your own build for when you play against them. The last tip that I have is one that I've often said in many of these newer competitive player sort of videos. So if you've heard it before, I apologize, but it is really crucial for players that are trying to be more successful, and that's that you should accept that you're not always right. And very often, especially if you're a newer competitive player, you might actually be wrong more often than you're correct. And that's perfectly fine, by the way. You shouldn't have to know everything about every deck and every combo when you're just starting out. And I think this is really toxic and damaging mindset from players who maybe only go to locals or only play with their friends and they think they're like the best player out there, and then they go to a regional or YCS and just get their butt kicked round after round after round. And that sucks, and some players don't enjoy that, but I think that you should take that as a humbling experience and realize, okay, maybe you didn't know as much as you thought you did, and how can you gain that extra knowledge so that the next time you're more prepared. And unfortunately, sometimes the reaction to those situations is the person goes, oh, I just got sacked every round, or oh, my opponent spent more money than me on the game, so of course they're going to beat me. And it's like, I understand conceptually at least that you want to deflect the blame off of yourself and onto literally anything besides you, because if you're the problem, then you have to admit that you're not as good as you think you are, but that's really bad if you're actually trying to improve. I mean, certainly it is true. We all get sacked sometimes, we all draw bad sometimes, but really going beyond yourself and saying, okay, if I'm complaining about getting sacked every single round and I've gone to like 6 regionals and I still don't have my invite, how are these better players than me, like the players that are consistently topping? What are they doing differently, and what can I actually improve upon instead of just blaming everything but myself? It's hard doing that. I know. I used to be one of those very cocky players with no credentials that thought I was better than everyone I played against, but over the past couple years especially, I realized that being the better player isn't just saying that you're the better player, it's actually performing well at tournaments. And if you're performing badly at every tournament you enter, I mean, it gets to a point where it's like, okay, the problem has to be yourself. You are the constant variable. If you're switching up decks, if you're switching up formats, but you're always performing badly, it's not your opponent sacking you every single round of every tournament. It might just be your misplaying, or your deck building isn't as good as the other players, and that's fine, but now you can take that and try to improve at the next tournament. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about these 5 easy ways to get better at Yu-Gi-Oh! If you've been watching my channel for a while, you might have heard a couple of these already, but I wanted to make a more updated modern video for the people that are just finding my channel, that they could watch and learn some of these tips. I still want to review one Halloween themed card at the end of every single day in October. I know I am behind. I actually had like 2 videos that I canceled, so unfortunately we're even more behind. On Halloween, I plan on reviewing 3 different monsters that all sort of go together and fit the Halloween theme very strongly, and I also am going to do a pretty long live stream for several hours. We're going to have a lot of fun. I love love streaming on Halloween. I usually dress up, so make sure to stay tuned for that. The first card that I want to talk about that is Halloween related in today's video is Goblin Zombie, a pretty old card. Way back in the day, it was a secret rare in Phantom Darkness, and it's a pretty good older school zombie card, even if it's not seeing that much play today. So what does this thing do? Well, it is a level 4 zombie, and it says when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, send the top card of their deck to the graveyard. But more importantly, when this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, add one zombie type monster with 1200 or less defense from your deck to your hand. Now what's really cool about this thing is that even though that effect is a when effect, it is not an optional effect, so it won't miss timing if you use this card for a link summon or a synchro summon. That's really nice, and also it does search itself in theory, but in a lot of cases you'd be searching things like Zombie Master out or Mizuki out with this Goblin Zombie. Nowadays, sending one card from the top of your opponent's deck to the graveyard isn't actually a benefit, and it might even be a downside, but back when this card was printed, it could snipe some pretty powerful spell cards so your opponent couldn't use them. Next up, we have a hand trap, Ghost Bell in Haunted Mansion, and what's funny is that right before October started, I actually did an entire video about this card, so you might have heard me talk about this card already, but it hasn't made it onto our October list of all these Halloween themed cards. In Ghost Bell in Haunted Mansion, I mean, it's a zombie monster, it has Haunted Mansion in the name, it is perfect for these cards. So what does this thing do? Well, it is a zombie tuner monster, it's level 3, and it says when a card or effect is activated that includes any of these effects, as a quick effect you can discard this card to negate that activation. The first thing it can negate is anything that adds a card or cards from a graveyard to the hand, deck, or extra deck. The second thing is special summoning a monster card or cards from the graveyard, and the last thing is banishing a card or cards from the grave. And of course, like many of the other Ghost Girl hand traps, it is in fact a hard once return effect. Ghost Bell in Haunted Mansion is actually pretty decent right now. You can stop the symbol skeleton that your opponent might use in an Orcus deck. You can stop a lot of cards just in general with Ghost Bell, but overall it's not the most popular choice, but it is certainly a choice. It is particularly good against the Thunder deck because you can use it against your opponent's Hawk, and why that matters is because this card negates the activation, not just the effect, like with Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. In this case, the reason that is so important here is because if your opponent has not used a Thunder effect from their hand, they can't summon Colossus. So if your opponent, for example, summons Batteryman Solar and sends a Thunder Dragon to the graveyard, or any random Thunder Dragon to the grave, not just the original one, and then they use Hawk, if you negate it with Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion, even though they do have that Solar on the field, they can't summon Colossus until they use another effect from the hand. The final card that I'm going to look at in today's video is mostly just played in Duel Links, but it was really good in Duel Links. I think it was even on their Forbidden and Limited list for a little while, and that is Samurai Skull. This is a level 4 dark zombie monster with 1700 attack points and 0 defense points. It says when this card is normal summon, you can send one zombie monster from your deck to the graveyard, so it is sort of like an Armageddonite, but not for dark monsters, but zombie monsters. The second effect says if this face-up card in its owner's control leaves the field because of an opponent's card effect, you can special summon one level 4 or lower zombie monster from your deck, except Samurai Skull. This card was super strong in Vampires, which was one of the top decks for many months in Duel Links, and it was sort of one of the better cards in the limited card pool that Duel Links has to offer. There are a lot of good Vampire cards that have graveyard effects, and Samurai Skull could send those to the grave right away. If you only play the TCG, you might underestimate how powerful the floating ability of this card is, but in Duel Links, especially at the time that Vampires were a top deck, a lot of players were playing Treacherous Trap Hole, and this card just sort of completely countered it. If your opponent did Treacherous Trap Hole this card, which they probably shouldn't, but if they did, you can then just special summon a Gozuki from your deck or any number of Vampire cards from your deck. It was just overall a very solid counter to one of the most commonly played trap cards of its era. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video as well as the zombie review at the end. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.